Hello and welcome. Today I want to talk about commander skills. Patch 0.6 changed the commander skill tree significantly, and today I would like to go over all of the skills and give you guys my opinion about them. In the description of the video you'll find the commander skill names and timestamps next to them, so you can skip over whichever skills you don't want to hear about, and skip to ones you do wish to hear about. Now, I'm not going to give you guys commander skill builds in this video, because I'm not quite certain on the builds myself. If you do want to hear about the things that I have currently decided to use, then please let me know and I might make a video in the future. Anyways, let's get straight to it. First skill, Priority Target. What this skill does is if somebody targets you, they select you with the X button or similar, the indicator that tells you that you are spotted will get a little circle in it with a number, and that number tells you how many ships have targeted you. In my opinion, this skill is the most underappreciated skill in the new skill tree, because it can give you extra information and it is very useful on ships that rely on not being shot at, but they still have to be in a situation where they are spotted while firing, for instance cruisers or Soviet destroyers. I think it's also very useful for battleships. Now, the reason is that if you are at long range and you are fighting, knowing this information whether somebody is starting to target you, in my opinion, is very important. And on top of everything else, the skill also tells you extra information. For instance, if you are in a situation where you are sailing around and there are 3 enemies around you and nobody else within firing range. However, the skill tells you that you are targeted by 4 people. Well, you obviously know and have found the missing destroyer on the enemy team, and that guy is probably targeting you. Not to mention that when people play destroyers, they are in specific habits. For instance, they will have their gun selected, they are targeting you. If they usually, want to get within range to fire torpedoes, then they switch to torpedoes, and after they fire their torpedoes, they will turn away and start running. And if you understand these habits, you might sometimes understand when they are firing torpedoes based on how the numbers change. Of course, it's not certain, but it is still extra information. In my opinion, this is the kind of thing that makes this skill successful over something like IFA, which would also tell you whether you're being fired at, but you cannot glean any extra information from that skill. So I think Priority Target is a very good skill and very useful, particularly on cruisers, Soviet destroyers, but it's also useful on other ships, and because it's a 1-point skill, I think that this is a very powerful skill. Next skill, Preventative Maintenance. What this skill does is it lowers the risk of incapacitation of modules by 30%. Modules here include your rudder, your engine, your main batteries, and I believe torpedoes. It does not include things like anti-air guns or secondaries. And I'm not quite certain how this specifically works though. I don't know if it's like a 30% increase in HP, or if when the gun would normally be destroyed, it rolls a dice, and if it's in the 30% it doesn't get destroyed. But this is also a very useful skill on ships like destroyers, and cruisers that are at risk of losing their engines or similar, and ships that are at risk of losing their main guns quite often. So you'll see some people take this on battleships, because battleships do get their main batteries knocked out, and usually when that happens it is at the worst time possible. So next skill, Expert Loader. This reduces your reload time by 50% when you are switching shell types. Basically what this means is if you have HE selected and you now switch over to AP, it reduces that cooldown by 50% because your guns will go on reload again. However, this only works if all of your guns have been reloaded. So I find that this skill is very weak. I don't find much use for it, because if you have certain shells already loaded, just fire them and then switch over. Sure, you'll fire a salvo with unoptimal shells, however, I don't think that 50% is worth it. Next skill, Aircraft Servicing Expert. Plus 5% to HP of carrier-based aircraft and minus 10% to servicing time of carrier-based aircraft. I think this is a very strong skill for carriers, And well, that's about it. You should always take this skill on an aircraft carrier. Next skill, Direction Center for Catapult Aircraft. I think this is also a very strong skill. This is something you would... basically what the skill does is it increases the number of catapult fighters you have, but it reduces their airspeed by 20%. And the interesting thing is that the catapult fighters or scout planes will fly in opposite directions, so they will both circle around your ship but in opposite directions. And I find this to be a very powerful skill because now you can launch 2 catapult fighters at once. It's useless for the scout planes, I mean not quite useless, but you don't really gain much from the scout planes anyway. I find this to be very good against carriers, because catapult fighters annoy carriers like no tomorrow, and having 2 of them just annoys them even more. However, because you have a priority target and preventative maintenance, it isn't taken as often. However, I do recommend it, especially on cruisers that have fighters, but nowadays, you know, you see less of them because ships that have radar tend to not have scout planes, so, you know, high-tier US cruisers are out and high-tier Soviet cruisers are out as well, so I think the skill is still good, and it is very annoying for carriers, so it's a 1-point skill I also recommend taking on pretty much anything you don't want priority target or preventative maintenance on, or you already have either of those. Next skill, Dogfighting Expert. Plus 10% to average damage per second of fighters for each tier of difference between them, and plus 10% to fighters' ammunition. So this is a skill I also recommend taking on every single carrier. However, you should already have your Air Supremacy skill before you take it on a carrier. So the ammunition buff is all around good for any carrier, and what the second portion of this skill does is it basically if you fight higher tier fighters than what your fighters are, your fighters will deal more damage. So this is very useful if you're like a Hiryu and you are going to run into a lot of carriers like the Saipan that have tier 9 planes, whereas your Hiryu has tier 7 planes, so this would give you a 20% average damage increase. It's also very useful when you are still in a stock carrier, because you tend to have 1 tier lower fighters than your opposition. Next skill, Incoming Fire Alert or IFA that I mentioned earlier. I think at this point this skill is completely obsolete. You should pretty much always just take Priority Target over this skill, because Priority Target gives you the information earlier, and it can also give you extra information that you cannot normally glean, because Incoming Fire Alert will only tell you that you are being shot at if, well, they have already fired, and you can already see the shells coming at you if they have already fired their guns anyway. It has very, very limited use, and Priority Target trumps the skill in every way I can imagine, so I definitely do not recommend taking this skill. And the next skill, Evasive Maneuver, this decreases your airspeed of strike aircraft when they have already dropped their load when they are returning to the carrier. Sorry, to specify, it reduces the airspeed of strike aircraft when they are returning to the carrier. It doesn't matter if they have already dropped their load or not, by 30%, and it increases the HP of strike aircraft when they are returning to the carrier by 75%. And it also reduces the detectability of those aircraft when returning to the carrier. Now, why it's important that it says returning to the carrier instead of when they have already dropped their load, because, you see, you can order your aircraft to come back to the carrier by pressing the F key. And apparently, I don't know if it still works, but it did work this way. You could give this order and the HP buff and the airspeed reduction would work normally. I don't really recommend this skill. It might become useful later on when people figure out a better way how to use it, but so far I don't recommend taking this on carriers. The next skill is High Alert. Minus 10% to reload time of the Damage Control Party consumable. Damage Control Party consumable is the R button, the one that fixes fire, flooding, engines, etc. So having this skill is definitely useful, however I'm not quite certain if this is worth 2 points. I think there are usually better skills that you would like to take, so I don't really recommend taking it. However, if you still have leftover points and you don't know what else to take, this skill will always be useful on pretty much any ship I can imagine. However, the next skill is Jack of all trades, minus 5% to reload time of all mounted consumables. This actually does include the damage control party consumable, so this is half of it. However, this works for any skill, including things like smoke screens, defensive fire, heals, etc. So I think that this skill is actually more powerful, because when you get to higher tiers, your ships tend to have more and more skills. You know, cruisers get things like heal and radar and defensive fire or hydro, and battleships, well, German ones get hydro as well, heals. So, and it's definitely useful for any kind of smokescreen, so I think that Jack of all trades is a fairly good skill, and I would take this over High Alert on most ships. However, again, I think that there are better skills to take than either of these two, so I usually have not taken this skill. So, the next skill, Expert Marksman. This skill works differently depending on your caliber of main guns. It increases the turret traverse by 2.5 degrees if your main turret or the guns are 139mm or lower caliber, and it increases your turret traverse speed by 0.7 degrees if it's higher than 139mm of caliber. So basically, for destroyers, it increases it by 2.5 degrees per second. For pretty much everything else, it's by 0.6 degrees. Now, I think that this skill is very, very, very useful on many ships, particularly battleships and many cruisers that don't have fast, turret traverse. I find that turret traverse is an ability or a statistic that many people don't really pay much attention to. But I think that turret traverse is incredibly important, because anytime you do any kind of evasive maneuvers, your turret traverse determines whether your guns will actually be able to keep pointing at the target and, keep firing at it. This is the biggest drawback of the Yamato, for instance. Really, really slow turret traverse, and it can cost you a lot while your ship is maneuverable. Well, if you cannot fire at enemies, you aren't really doing all that much useful stuff. And I think Expert Marksman, because of that, is very, very powerful. So, this is a skill I recommend on almost every battleship. I think I actually have taken it on every single battleship I have played, but you don't really need it on all of them. Like, ships like the Scharnhorst, I think, don't need it. Friedrich der Grosse might get away without using it. However, many people at higher tiers also take the reload module, which reduces your turret traverse, so you might use this skill to counteract that one. But this is a skill I recommend quite often. Next skill, Torpedo Acceleration. Plus 5 knots to torpedo speed and minus 20% to torpedo range. Now, this is a skill that you should always take on a carrier, you should always take this skill on a carrier if your carrier has torpedo bombers. And I think the only ship you don't have torpedo bombers on is the Saipan if you go for the very, very terrible build that I don't recommend going. So this skill is something I would always take on a carrier, and I don't really recommend this on most destroyers. However, you can take it to do things like this is a skill that is useful on a ship like Gearing, because the Gearing has 16.5 kilometer torpedoes and don't really need that much range, so having 5 knots faster torpedoes for almost no real trade-off other than taking the skill, I think is very strong. On top of that, you can take it on ships like the Shimakaze. If you take the 12 kilometer torpedoes, this would make your torpedoes 9.6 kilometers, but they would be 72 knots. So, they would be more longer range than the F3 torpedoes, however, they would be slightly slower. But this is a nice trade-off type of skill, and I recommend it on some ships, but I don't know, usually not. Because there are better skills you can take, so if you don't necessarily need the torpedo speed, well, perhaps, maybe not take this skill. Next skill is Smokescreen Expert, plus 20% to the radius of smokescreen. Now, this is a skill in random battles I do not recommend taking at all. I have heard that maybe you could take this in competitive play, but honestly I don't think that it's worth it. Right now I feel like smokescreen size is good enough, and it doesn't really warrant spending 2 points, so generally I would recommend staying away from this skill. Next skill, Expert Rare Gunner, plus 10% to the average damage per second of self-defense armament of aircraft with rare gunners. So basically any kind of strike aircraft, things like torpedo bombers or dive bombers have rare gunners, and what they do is they essentially attack fighters that attack those planes. And this increases their damage per second. However, it was a questionable skill when it was 1 point in the last tree, and for some reason with the new patch it has been moved to a 2-point skill, which makes it even less of a skill you would like to pick up, so I generally don't recommend it. There are better skills to take for carriers, and for everything else, this is not really worth it. Next skill, Adrenaline Rush. Now this is an incredible skill. It increases your reload, or lowers your reload time of all types of armament by 0.2% for each 1% of HP lost. So basically, if you lose 50% of your maximum HP, your reload is, all of your main armament reload is increased by 10%. Main armament here includes your main guns, torpedoes. I believe it also includes aircraft servicing, you know, like torpedo bombers, etc. It is supposed to also affect secondary guns eventually, but right now it doesn't, and it does not affect anti-aircraft guns, and from what I understand there are no plans to change that. But I think this is an incredible skill and very, very strong for 2 points. This is a skill I often recommend on many ships. So yeah, this is a skill I do recommend for pretty much everything, especially battleships, because battleships almost always take damage, so getting faster reload is just that good. Next skill is Last Stand. The ship remains able to move and maneuver while the engine or steering gears are incapacitated. So basically, when somebody destroys your rudder or engine, your ship is still able to turn their rudder just at a slower speed, and they can still move around if their engine is broken, just again at a lower speed. But this lower speed is not actually that significant. It is still very, very fast on a destroyer, and this is a skill I recommend taking on pretty much every destroyer. Maybe not on torpedo destroyers, because you don't really want to get into gunfights anyway. However, it is still a very useful survivability skill, and I do recommend this. Because this can literally mean, you know, the difference between life and death. Because if you don't have your damage control party available, and somebody knocks out your rudder while you are detected in a destroyer, you are pretty much dead. Same for if your engine gets knocked out. So this is a skill I do recommend on pretty much every destroyer. Next up is Basics of Survivability. This reduces your time to repair, extinguish fires, and recover from flooding by 15%. So basically you recover from these things 15% faster. Your engine repairs 15% faster, your rudder repairs, etc. This used to be a tier 1 skill earlier, and when it was a tier 1 skill, you should always take this on ships like battleships. Nowadays though, because it's a tier 3 skill, it's questionable, because you still spend 3 points on it, and I don't know if it's really worth it. Because you see, right now the flooding part is useless, it doesn't do anything. With the new patch, however, or new flooding changes that are planned, this can be useful for the flooding stuff if you also use the flooding reduction flag and the module. However, without those, in terms of flooding it doesn't do much, and in terms of the repairs it also doesn't do much. So mainly it just reduces the duration of fires by 15% usually. And I think that it is worth it for on many occasions. However, I think there are better tier 3 skills quite often that you want to take instead. So I would take this on a battleship if you still have 3 points left over everything else, and don't think that Vigilance is worth it. However, you know, I think that this skill often just competes with Vigilance on battleships. Next up is Survivability Expert. This increases your maximum HP by 350 for each tier of your ship. So a tier 10 ship gets 3500 HP from this. A tier 5 ship gets 1750 HP from this. And I think that Survivability Expert is a fairly good skill on destroyers. Before you would take this quite often, but nowadays there are often better tier 3 skills to take for many destroyers. And I think this is more of a skill you would take in ranked, because in ranked having more survivability tends to be more useful than in random battles, because in random battles you're often still trying to get maximum experience and usually, you know, surviving for slightly longer instead of dealing more damage is not that useful. I think that on a destroyer, something like basic firing training will serve you better than Survivability Expert. And I don't recommend this skill at all on carriers, battleships or cruisers, because the 3500 HP, or you know, even less than that, is not really worth 3 points. Next skill, Torpedo Armament Expertise, minus 10% to reload time of torpedo tubes and minus 20% to servicing time of torpedo bombers. This is a skill you should always take on a carrier, again if you have torpedoes of course, which you pretty much will unless you go the stupid build on the Saipan, so you should always take this skill on a carrier captain, and this is also useful for torpedo destroyers like the Shiratsu and Shimakaze. I'm not quite certain if you should take it on pretty much any of the other destroyers though, because okay, I suppose you should take it on ships like the Fujin, Kamikaze, etc. But it's mainly focused on torpedo destroyers. On many of the other ships, I don't think it's really worth it. However, of course, you know, there might be a build where it is worth it. So this is, again, useful for any kind of torpedo ships. Next up is Emergency Takeoff, plus 100% to aircraft servicing time when the carrier is on fire. While this seems like a useful carrier skill, because, you know, when your ship is on fire, you can launch your planes really fast. However, you should never really be in a situation where a ship is on fire for extended periods of time, so honestly, you should spend these 3 points in a better way, because the main way your ship will be set on fire is when an enemy carrier attacks you with dive bombers, so instead take a skill that increases your anti-aircraft capabilities. Which carrier builds actually take, and they don't have any points for this, so I don't recommend taking this skill at all. Next up, Basic Firing Training, minus 10% to reload time of main battery guns with a caliber up to and including 139mm and secondary battery guns, plus 20% to average damage per second of AA defense. So, this skill makes your guns reload faster by 10% on any secondaries and any guns up to 139mm, so, you know, destroyer guns and Atlanta and Flint guns, basically. It's a useful skill because this increases the main battery effectiveness on those ships, and it also increases anti-aircraft damage by 20%, so if you want to go an anti-aircraft build, this is a skill you might often take. But I don't know if you actually have enough points for it, so often you might end up not taking this skill at all. But it might be worth it on destroyers. I don't really recommend it on battleships or cruisers or carriers unless you're going some kind of weird full anti-air build. So it's mostly a skill you would want to take on destroyers, and you would have to weigh in whether this is the best skill to take or whether something like Demolition Expert might serve you better. I don't know the answer for that, so usually I don't recommend it, but sometimes, like on the Khabarovsk, it might be worth it. Next up is Superintendent. It gives 1 additional charge to all consumables mounted on a ship. Now this is a skill I would recommend on almost every high tier ship, except carriers of course again. Because cruisers, high tier cruisers get a heal, high tier or battleships in general get a heal, destroyers have smoke screens, and you generally want more consumable charges, especially on things like heals and smoke screens. Now if you're going to play a ship like the Shores or other similar ship that don't have access to heals or smoke screens, you might not want to take it, but eventually, you know, cruisers get to a higher tier and they do get access to heals. So you might still want to take it for the future. Because having that extra heal on a ship like a battleship can mean the difference between having, 2000 HP or 17,000 HP. And that seems quite significant, doesn't it? and it works its magic in extended games. So if you're somebody that always rushes in and dies, well, first of all, I recommend reconsidering your playstyle. But if you're not going to reconsider, then I suppose the skill isn't very useful. But, you know, if you're playing the game, you're trying to have fun, right? And the most fun is to have the most amazing game ever, right? And in my opinion, if you're at the end of the game and you're like, I don't know, 2 against 5, then having that extra smokescreen or extra heal can just be so amazing and make that already good game that much better. And honestly, in my opinion, Superintendent is a skill that I would recommend really, really hard, and I think it's one of the best tier 4 or tier 3 skills. Because just that extra heal or extra smoke is so good. Next skill is Demolition Expert. It increases your fire chance with your main batteries or secondary batteries by 2%. Now, it used to be a tier 4 skill at 3%, and it was a fairly powerful skill. Nowadays, though, at 2%, it's not as powerful, but again, it is still strong, and on many ships it is worth it. Especially ships that don't have a high fire chance as a base. Like ships that have 5% fire chance, plus 2% is a 40% increase, so it's a useful skill, but you have to weigh it, again, usually against skills like basic firing training, so because you're most likely going to take it on ships that also take advantage of skills like basic firing training. It's a skill I recommend, but again, you have to weigh it against something else as well. And last up on tier 3 is Vigilance. Plus 25% to acquisition range of torpedoes. What this does is, you will spot torpedoes incoming to your ship 25% further away. From what I understand, either the skill or the module also, or perhaps even both, stack with hydroacoustic search. Now, to make sure that this actually works, if this is what you're going to make your decision based upon, just check the comments. Somebody will definitely correct me whether this does or does not affect the hydroacoustic search consumable. But basically, you just spot torpedoes further away, and this is a very useful defensive tool on many ships. You will find use for this skill in destroyers, cruisers, battleships. Carriers not so much, because you'll know those torpedoes are coming anyway generally, and even if you don't, you're not going to be able to react to them anyway. So this is a skill I do recommend, but honestly you have to weigh it against skills like Survivability Expert and Basics of Survivability, depending on the ship you're playing. I find that this skill is more useful in ranked scenarios because, at least from my experience, in ranked you'll often run into situations where one destroyer just gets caught off guard by torpedoes and dies, and because of that the enemy team gets an advantage and they push that advantage and then win the game. So being safer against torpedoes in ranked battles tends to be more important in my opinion, and that's why I value this skill more in those scenarios. However, generally you can play in a way where you can relatively safely play against torpedoes without having this skill. So you don't necessarily need it. However, many people swear by it, and I don't really use it, but I have thought of using it, and I figure it might be useful because, you know, other very good players do use it. Time for tier 4 skills. Manual fire control for secondary armament. Minus 15% to the maximum dispersion of shells for the secondary armament of tier 1 to 6, and minus 60% for tier 7 and above. So what this skill does is it reduces the dispersion on your secondary guns, which means that they are more likely to hit, by a very significant amount at tier 7 and above. I think at tier 6 and lower, this skill is not worth it, and I do not recommend taking it at tier 6 and lower. I recommend taking this skill in conjunction with a skill like Advanced Firing Training, because you're going for a secondary build then, and those are very useful and they synergize well with each other. And I recommend this on ships with strong secondaries like the Bismarck, the Friedrich der Große, Großer Kurfürst, maybe the Izumo, and maybe the Yamato. On other ships, I don't really recommend this skill. This skill also comes with another downside. Your secondary guns will only open fire on a target that you have selected, you know. You hold down control and you click on the ship. That will select the target and your secondaries will fire on that target only. Which means that if you are in the middle of enemies, your secondaries will only open up fire on one side because you can only select one target at once. However, I think it is often very worth it, because you can increase your secondary gun range often to 10.6 kilometers, which means that if you end up in a standoff or other situation, your secondaries will rain hell on your enemies and set fires and deal damage, and be generally really annoying because they will be fairly accurate, unlike they are without this skill. It's a strong skill, but only over on tier 7 and higher ships. Next up, fire prevention, minus 10% to the risk of fire. The maximum number of fire sources on a ship is reduced to 3. Now the first part, the minus 10%, is multiplicative, so if an enemy ship with an HE shell that has a fire chance of 20% fires at you and hits, that 20% is now reduced by 10% to 18%. So, 20% times 0.9 is 18. But the important part on this skill is the second part, and it's not the fact that it reduces it just to 3, it's where it reduces it. You see, ships are in 4 sections. The front section, 2 middle section, and 1, back section, the aft section, so to say. And it's important, and this skill is important because often when people set 2 fires on you, 2 of those fires, or those 2 fires, will be both in the middle section because that's where your superstructure is, and people generally aim at your superstructure with HE shells. And the other reason is that it's the center of the ship, it's easier to hit. And what this skill does is it combines the 2 middle sections of your ship, so it ends up reducing the amount of fire damage you take quite significantly. Personally, I use this skill on my Yamato and I think even on the Montana, but I'm not quite certain if this is the best skill to take. Well, for 2 reasons, because it makes it a lot harder to get your fireproof flags, and well, there might be better skills to take, because if you are going for secondary build, you can only take a maximum of 3 tier 4 skills, and that is if you only take one of the other tier skills. And if you're going for a secondary build, for instance, you want to take your manual secondary and advanced firing training, which is 2 tier 4 skills already. And I definitely recommend also taking expert marksman and adrenaline rush on a battleship like the Kurfürst, which means you just don't have enough points for fire prevention. So you might not end up actually taking this skill. Next up is IFHE, or Inertia Fuse for HE shells. Plus 30% to the armor penetration capacity of HE shells, and minus 3% to the fire chance on HE shells. Now this is a skill that is very situational, or rather, it depends very much on the ship you use this skill on. On some ships it's pretty much useless, on others it's incredibly powerful. You see, the way HE penetration works is that it doesn't care about range, it doesn't care about angle, but what it does is it cares about the caliber of your HE shell. So it takes your HE caliber, divides it by 6 or 4 in the case of German battleships, and that is the amount of armor your HE shells are able to penetrate up to. So if you have 120mm caliber HE shells, they are able to penetrate, divided by 6, 20mm of HE, or 20mm of armor. But 20mm is not included. Only up to 19mm is included, so, there will be breakpoints where it is and is not useful. And this skill ends up being at breakpoints where it is useful for gun calibers of 155mm and below, so on ships like the Akizuki it is incredibly powerful, Belfast it is incredibly powerful. Mikhail Kutuzov, it is incredibly powerful. Shores, Chapayev. Those are ships that it is incredibly powerful on because they will take the HE penetration above the breakpoints of the armor that those ships will face. Now this isn't useful, or not very useful, on heavy cruisers with 203mm HE caliber guns like the Des Moines. It is useful in that they will be able to now penetrate the deck armor of US battleships. But only US battleships. It isn't going to affect German battleships or Japanese battleships, so I don't think it is worth it on heavy cruisers. So again, I would only take this skill on ships like the Kutuzov, Belfast, Shores, Chapayev, and maybe not even Shores and Chapayev, because eventually you will get to the Moskva where you don't need the skill. And then maybe Atlanta, Flint, and definitely the Akizuki. Next up, Air Supremacy. This increases the amount of fighters and bombers you have in a squadron by 1. It doesn't affect torpedo bombers, and it only works on aircraft carriers, so this is a carrier exclusive skill, and I definitely recommend taking this on every carrier you play. This is incredibly important because if you before had 4 fighters in a squadron on a Japanese carrier, and you now would have 5, which would give you, well, air supremacy. Next up is advanced firing training, plus 20% to the firing range of main batteries that are up to 139mm, and plus 20% to firing range of all secondaries, and plus 20% to anti-air range. This is a very strong skill. You will want to take this skill on many ships. If you want to go for a secondary build, you want this skill. If you want to go for an anti-air build, you want this skill. If you are a ship like an Atlanta or Flint that just wants more main battery range, you will want this skill, or maybe some destroyer. So this is a skill I'd recommend, and I also recommend this on many battleships, even like battleships like the Yamato, because this increases your anti-air by quite a lot. You see, the Yamato and many other battleships like her have enough anti-air DPS, or, you know, at least some anti-air DPS. However, it is mostly limited to their mid or short range anti-air guns, and many enemy planes like torpedo bombers are not going to spend a lot of time in your short or mid-range anti-air gun range. So if you increase that range, that will boost your anti-air capability by quite a bit. And it's also very useful on, well, any ship that goes for anti-air builds, like the Minotaur or Neptune or Des Moines. So this is a skill I recommend on many ships. Oh, and the Moskva, of course. Next up is manual fire control for anti-air armament, or also known as manual anti-air or manual AA. Plus 100% to average damage per second of anti-air guns with a caliber above 85mm against a priority target. So basically it takes the long range caliber AA guns on your ship, and it doubles their damage output. However, it only does it if you select the target, just like with manual secondaries. You hold down the control button, the control key, and you select the fighter squadron. Often that can actually be quite problematic in hectic situations that you end up being in when planes attack you. However, it's very useful on many German battleships like the Gneisenau or maybe the Friedrich der Grosse, or, you know, similar, because it increases the long-range anti-air damage output, which, you know, the long-range anti-air guns are going to fire at enemy planes the longest, and it ends up being very powerful. It's also powerful on ships like the Moskva and well, US battleships if you're going for an anti-air build, and this is a skill you generally want to take on anti-air builds. So a ship like the North Carolina benefits a lot from this skill if you want to be incredibly annoying to carriers. However, of course, you have to keep in mind that if you don't meet a carrier, the skill doesn't really do anything for you. Next up is radio location. This shows an indicator in the direction of the nearest enemy ship, and it's like 16 sectors around your ship. So if you get very close very close to an enemy ship, it tends to be more accurate than at a long range. And with this skill you can essentially know where the closest enemy is. It gives a lot of information and it is very useful in that regard. However, quite often you can have a fairly good idea of where many of the enemy ships are, and it doesn't work on carriers. There was a lot of drama before the skills were actually added about this skill. People thought that it was going to be incredibly overpowered. Now, I think that it's a useful skill, but it's not as useful as people made it out to be. It's strong, and I would mostly recommend it on destroyers that are either trying to avoid enemy destroyers or trying to hunt enemy destroyers. So, US destroyers like the Gearing or Fletcher that are trying to hunt enemy destroyers because they will know where the enemy destroyers are going to be, or destroyers like the Shimakaze or Shiratsu that will try to avoid enemy destroyers, you know, to try to torpedo enemy big ships. The way this is useful for a ship like the Shimakaze is that when you're trying to go for a torpedo run with torpedoes like the F3s or, you know, other torpedoes, you want to get as close as possible without being detected. However, there is some risk to it because you don't know the exact locations of every enemy ship all the time. So there might be an enemy destroyer in between the enemy battleship and you. So if you get too close you will be spotted and that will ruin your torpedo run and potentially even kill your ship. With radio location you will be fairly certain that an enemy destroyer is not around that ship, so you will be able to get slightly closer. And this skill is also very useful at the end of the game when you need to either hunt one singular enemy down or you need to run away. Also, this skill was called Radio Position Finder earlier, so you will hear many people call this skill RPF. And the last skill, which is Concealment Expert, minus 10% to the detectability of destroyers, minus 12% to cruisers, minus 14 to battleships, minus 16 to aircraft carriers. Now this skill is very powerful. This is useful on literally every single ship in the game. However, there is obviously going to be a difference. On some ships it's going to be better on others it's going to be worse on. This is a skill you want to take on pretty much every single destroyer other than Soviet destroyers because you want your concealment to be better. Basically, your concealment range is what determines if how far away an enemy has to be from you to detect you. And, you know, having a lower concealment range is always better. Now, this is useful on destroyers other than Soviet destroyers. Well, it's useful on Soviet destroyers too, but you generally are fast enough on a Soviet destroyer to dodge enemy shells, so you want to just keep firing at enemies and you will always be spotted anyway, so you don't really need this skill. You might as well use the points on other skills instead. But on other destroyers this skill is vital. This is one of the strongest skills in the game in my opinion. On cruisers, the same reasoning applies. You want to be stealthy, you want to be able to run away, you want to be able to surprise, well, destroyers, other ships, whatever. And it's actually even useful on, well, mini battleships, because if you stack your concealment reduction things like Concealment Expert, the Concealment Module and the Camouflage, you will get to, well, 13.5 kilometer concealment on ships like the Yamato or Montana, or something around that. And the way concealment works is that once you fire your guns, your concealment gets increased for 20 seconds. However, battleships tend to have reloads longer than 20 seconds, so if you have a gunfight against another battleship at, like, I don't know, 14 kilometer range, what happens is that you will fire your guns, and then you will be spotted for 20 seconds, but then you will not be spotted for another, like, say, 10 seconds or however long it takes until you fire your guns again. And this can disrupt the enemy from, well, fighting you properly, because they will have to match your rate of fire, and they will have to fire at you after you have fired. So I think that this is a useful skill And now with the new tree where you have more points left over on carriers, well, you even take this skill on aircraft carriers, so this is a skill you can take on pretty much every class of ship. So anyways, I hope you guys learned something, and thanks for those that stuck through everything and listened to this. I hope you learned something. And well, I just wanted to get my opinions out on these skills. So if you like this video, then like it. If not, then dislike it. And well, if you would like me to make a skill build video, then let me know in the comments. And I would like to thank my Patreons on Patreon. Thank you very much for your continued support, Dangolon, and I hope I see you guys next time.